Let me see if this is working on YouTube.
Otherwise, we can always tweet the Zoom link if you prefer.
No. This is, yeah, we are on YouTube. We are on YouTube, no problem. Yes. Yeah. So here we are. Are we ready to go?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to this evening's HLF Online, another edition of HLF Online. On my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues, Mr. Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Tharoor to our HLF online sessions. Good evening, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be our guest this evening.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, and I'm sorry that earlier attempts didn't work. Yeah. Delighted now that we are together, even though it's virtual and not in the lovely city of Hyderabad.
Yes, we are distanced, but together.
Indeed, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I know you have been, I think, shuttling between sessions on the book.
That's right.
We are delighted that you found the time to be with us this evening. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we should waste any time in trying to introduce Dr. Tharoor. I think it would be silly on my part to even try that. So I won't even try that. Almost all of you must have received the email invite, which had a brief bio of Dr. Tharoor, as well as a quick summary of the book. So without any further ado, I would like to begin the discussion with Dr. Tharoor, for which I'm sure all of you are waiting for. So Dr. Tharoor, once again, thank you for joining us this evening. And I would like to begin by asking something which is perhaps not directly related to the book, that although your first book, published book, was nonfiction, you sort of made a spectacular debut in fiction with The Great Indian Novel.
Thank you, yes.
But after that, I think that was 1989, after that, a couple of other novels, you seem to have abandoned fiction.
That's very true. And in fact, it's a frequent complaint I get from the fans of my fiction whenever I publish a new book and it turns out to be nonfiction yet again.
Yes.
The reason is very simple, Professor Saab. I'm trying to juggle, as you know, my writing life with my professional life, first at the United Nations and then in Indian politics. And inevitably, when you take on a professional responsibility, that has to take priority. And both my professions have been highly demanding ones, which took a lot of time, took a lot of energy, a lot of commitment. Now, the thing with fiction is you need not just time, which is scarce enough, you actually carve out often late at night or during travels or whatever, the time to think and write is already a challenge. But with fiction, you also need a space inside your head to create an alternative universe, a fictional universe whose characters, incidents, concerns, stories, lines of dialogue should be as real to you as what you're experiencing in your everyday life. That requires building a sort of palace of illusion, which is far too easily shattered by reality. Unless you can inhabit it every day, even if you're writing only 1,000 words a day, as my friend Amitav Ghosh says, he doesn't usually produce more than that, but at least he's writing something every day to build up a story in his mind and on the page. Whereas someone like me, I could start a book now, it could be interrupted tomorrow by an election campaign for the next 3 weeks, and I won't be able to return to it till after the results of that are out, for example. Or I could, in my UN days, suddenly have to go off to Yugoslavia or go off to some crisis spot in the world and not be able to come back. So after a while, when I found my laptop and my desktop at home littered with incomplete attempts at fiction, because each time I created this world and the glass palace was shattered, it was difficult to pile it up together again and rebuild it. I decided that in the interest of my own sanity, I should take a break from fiction and write interruptible prose, which is what nonfiction is. Now I need to go back, and everyone tells me I should. So perhaps my next major project will indeed be a work of fiction, though probably my next book may be connected to the 75th anniversary of India's independence, and therefore it may be too early for me to return to fiction. But in the next few years, there will be fiction, definitely. From
the new great Indian novel, I suppose.
No, well, a different kind of Indian novel. I hope that some of you will consider it to be great enough.
Because I was wondering whether this giving up of fiction is more to do with the post-truth era, where fact has become stranger than fiction, and but when it comes to non-fictional writings, at least in the recent past, the two subjects that seem to be engaging your attention are nation and Hinduism. So I was wondering whether there is any connection between the two.
It's interesting, Professor Saab. There is a connection, and the connection is really something which ought not to have been such a major preoccupation. In fact, when I first came into politics, I really expected to be devoting my life to the aspirations of economic growth and transformation. A lot of young people were excited by my entry. I was excited to give voice to what they were keen on seeing happening in the country. I really thought that was what my political life would end up focusing on. Instead, I've found, certainly with the rise of Mr. Modi's BJP, and in particular in the last few years, there has been a complete distraction from the aspirations of young Indians to see economic growth, transformation, a widening of life opportunities, new technology, new initiatives, all of that. And instead, a complete diversion to the politics of identity, and in particular of Hindutva. Now, the reason these concerns that you have questioned me on have all arisen is precisely because of the fact that two areas on which, frankly, I thought that I could take my views for granted suddenly became fundamentally questioned. The first was my own idea of Hinduism. I was born in a Hindu family, grew up in a Hindu family, consider myself a believer of Hindu faith and tradition, have read fairly extensively from the philosophical and idea underpinnings of the Hindu religion and Hindu philosophy. And I have a fairly good idea of Hinduism's eclecticism, its pluralism, its acceptance of difference and diversity. For example, a lot of my Hinduism was imbibed from Swami Vivekananda, whom I've been reading since my teens, and I would consider myself a very serious Vivekananda bhakt, if you like, except that Vivekananda actually preached a very different bhakti from what the Hindutva movement is doing. Now, Hinduism, to my mind, is a personal concern for me as an individual, but it's inclusive of all ways of worship. But what I've seen with the rise of Hindutva is a political doctrine that actually takes the name of Hinduism, but bears no resemblance to the principal tenets of the Hindu faith that I have read, practiced, studied, and believe in. It is absolutely indifferent to Hindu philosophy and devotion, and cares about Hinduism only as a badge of identity. It is communal Hinduism and not philosophic Hinduism or lived Hinduism.
But
Hinduism is a faith that's open to reform and progress, which is why we've had it for 4,000 years, whereas Hindutva is anchored in the racial pride ethos that spawned fascism in the 1920s. It's reactionary and it's regressive. And I can't accept that Hindutva political doctrine speaks for me as a Hindu. And that's why I needed to write Why I'm a Hindu. As for the political arguments about nation and nationhood, if you read India from Midnight to the Millennium, which is my book about the first 50 years of India's independence, you find that I have already an assumption about what Indian nationhood is and how it's not like European nationhood, because it's not about either language or ethnicity or religion. It subsumes multiple variants of all of these things, of languages, of regions, of colors of skin, of religious belief, of caste, all of these differences. But you can be a good Muslim, a good Bengali, and a good Indian all at once. That multiplicity and that diversity was for me the essential logic of nationalism as embodied in the Constitution of India, which, as you know, recognizes equality of people irrespective of their immutable identities from birth. Now, that's being questioned by the Hindu Rashtra idea. The political majoritarianism of the BJP has meant that they have moved away from this basic assumption about Indian nationhood embodied in the Constitution to give a totally different challenge by saying that we will have a Hindu Rashtra. And the slogan of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan is essentially no longer an inclusion of diversities, but rather a pursuance of uniformity, of monoliths, of one communal identity as the defining basis of the Indian nation and the idea of Indian nationhood. So that too I had to challenge. And since it's being done in the name of Hinduism, Hinduism also comes in. Now, you've covered my last 4 books through that question, but there you are.
No, but I was also thinking, because is that because for a long time, as you just indicated, that we have taken these two things for granted, and therefore, when these ideas were challenged, in a way, I thought we were caught napping, and to talk about religion, to talk about nation, was not something that was actually done in a very rigorous manner, because I thought, we took nationalism for granted, we took secularism for granted, and suddenly when there is a kind of an opposition to that, suddenly we were scrambling to get our thoughts together.
No, that's a very fair observation, Professor. And I would say that what is more, I think you're absolutely correct that they are challenging this because those of us who took it for granted never felt it necessary to articulate and defend something that seemed to us self-evident. In fact, it's very interesting. When I argue, for example, in my book, The Battle of Belonging, that India's anti-colonial nationalism converted itself into a civic nationalism with the Constitution of India, which emerged from 3 years of discussion and debate. It's not as if these issues weren't debated. There were people who stood up in the Constituent Assembly and said, now that Pakistan has been created as a country for Muslims, why shouldn't we be a country for Hindus? And was debated and thrashed out, and a conclusion was arrived at by learned, knowledgeable, and humane minds that said, no, our freedom struggle was for everybody and our country must be for everybody. And all these issues were settled between 47 and 50 and reflected in the Constitution we have. Yes, the word secular is a later addition, but even if you take that word out, it's still a secular constitution because it talks about equality of all. It gives you freedom of opinion, freedom of religion. It even gives you not only freedom of worship, but the freedom of propagation of your form of worship. You are allowed to proselytize. All of these things in the Constitution make it a completely secular constitution and not a majoritarian one. Now, they are challenging this, and one of their criticisms of my kind of argument, which I've heard myself thrown at me, is Shashi Tharoor acts as if Indian nationhood began in 1950. We are an ancient civilization. To which my answer is, but my writings prove that I have a faith in my ancient civilization. But my ancient civilization is not what you're portraying. It's a civilization that is anchored in an acknowledgement of diversity, that has multiple forms of worship all embraced, that has been extraordinarily willing to coexist with people of different backgrounds, different colors, different ways of worship, different gods to worship, all of that. And at the same time, relationship with various other influences, including in relation to and reaction to Islam, in relation to and in reaction to colonialism. Our civilization of today is not some pristine Vedic thing that was frozen solid. It has been evolving and interacting and so on. And therefore, the civilization of India is very much part of the assumptions that we see reflected in the Civic Nationalist Constitution of 1950.
Yeah.
But that's something that these people challenge. They want to posit their view of ancient India against our view of modern India, whereas I would argue my view of modern India is very much anchored in the ancient civilizational traditions of a broad, inclusive society.
But you also mentioned, for example, in this beautifully produced book, that very early in the book, you also draw our attention to the dilemma of having to use Western notions of nation and nationalism while discussing, the reality of India and the East altogether. So, is that really the problem? The problem is that civic nationalism, as you talk about, is drawn on an kind of an idea of cosmopolitanism, etc. And that cliched contrast between you are talking about India and they are talking about Bharat.
That's true. But the counter answer to that is, first of all, is there really that much of a difference? I understand what the difference is all about. I don't want to be dumb.
Yeah.
But first of all, to take the first part of your comment about Western ideas, nationalism emerged when Western societies were much less cosmopolitan, much more monolithic. So, I mean, till about 30 years ago, a German by definition was white, Christian, and spoke German. A Frenchman, by definition, was white, Christian, and spoke French, etc. I mean, it was almost unthinkable. An exception to any of those categories was unusual. Today, neither of those countries is like that anymore. Both have accepted, acknowledged, and integrated minorities of different religions, different colors, and even different languages into their society. Of course, France, still the primacy of French is overwhelming, but there are Turkish-speaking minorities in Germany that worship Islam, that are brown in color. Of course, there are North African Muslims who've come into France. So you're seeing that Europe is becoming cosmopolitanism and is struggling to reconcile their earlier ethno-religious nationalism with the civic nationalism called upon by 21st century realities. America, on the other hand, was always civic nationalist. Anybody of any background could come in and be part of that adventure. India chose very consciously and deliberately the option of civic nationalism. And you may say that Bharat is different. It isn't cosmopolitan. It isn't anchored in an English language constitution. It is a much more traditional place. But I would argue the traditions of India are not regressive, intolerant, majoritarian chauvinism as the Hindutva movement would have us pretend. After all, where is this whole idea of Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, which across northern India was practiced for centuries? Even to this day, in Hindutva-ruled UP, you cannot conduct the Ram Leela in Banaras without buying mosques made by Muslim artisans who've been doing it for 200 years or 300 years. So the fact is that there is an interrelationship that sustains Bharat as well. So this facile distinction between India and Bharat actually implies that Bharat is somehow much more pristine, untouched, pure Hinduism that excludes all alien influences. And I don't actually buy that. I actually think that traditional India was anchored in a much more diverse civilization than these people give it credit for being.
Then in the book, you trace the rise or the upsurge of this Hindutva to the failure of neoliberalism and globalization. Can we say that, because I think it's one thing to observe the upsurge and another to try and understand in the larger context. So if we ask the question, why has it happened when it has happened?
Well, I think the global phenomenon definitely has to do with, in my view anyway, it definitely has to do with the entire phenomenon of the backlash against globalization, which to a great extent is inevitable if you think about it. There have to be winners and losers in any major new ambitious project. And the losers are bound to resent the winners. And also, for example, in the Western world, in countries like America, the working class, the blue-collar workers who suddenly found that they were not able to look forward to the same kind of progress and advancement that their fathers and grandfathers' generation have been able to, they turned around and said, why are these elites in our own country sending our jobs off to Shanghai or Bangalore for that matter, or Hyderabad? And similarly, when the people in Britain found that thanks to being in the EU, their streets and villages and bus stops and restaurants were being crowded by people speaking obscure East European languages, a certain xenophobia arose. There was this backlash both economically and culturally to the alien elements coming into their societies, or the perception that what was legitimately theirs was being usurped by others. Now, I would argue, you would argue, I'm sure, that this is actually trying to hold back the tide. The world has moved irresistibly on. No one can uninvent the internet or shut down satellite communications or permanently ground the jet planes. Yes, the pandemic has done the last thing, but once the pandemic goes, even that will no longer be an obstacle. So ultimately, one has to deal with this backlash. But there has been a resurgence globally of assertive national sovereignty. And that has been a major factor, which has manifested itself in greater economic sort of prioritization for local economies, local manufacturing, local production, lines being shifted, and even supply chains being a dependence on foreign supply chains being reduced. And at the same time, culturally, a certain amount of xenophobia, a certain amount of anti-immigration, a certain desire to push people out. Now, all of this has consequences for everyone, but in the Indian case, it's a slightly different story. See, Mr. Modi, in a paradoxical way, represents, if you like, one half of the equation, the cultural backlash. He is also attacking the cosmopolitan, deracinated English-speaking elites whom he feels have taken the country in the wrong direction. He wants to kick us all out, the so-called Lutyens gang in Delhi, and restore the primacy of a more rooted, authentic Hindutva nationalism, as he sees it. But at the same time, he doesn't want the economic backlash. He wants to be Davos man. He doesn't want to reject Davos man. He wants foreigners to come and make in India. He wants more supply chains to integrate Indian companies. He wants Indian manufacturers to be exporting. So all of these things embody a contradiction in India, which is not the same as, say, Mr. Trump's kind of belligerence or the Brexit movement in the UK. It's a different story here. It's an economic backlash, but not a cultural backlash. I beg your pardon. It's not an economic backlash. It is a cultural backlash.
Yeah.
In those circumstances, we are seeing in India a particular contradiction, because the more you promote your cultural backlash, the more you undermine your economic internationalism. Because, for example, already when there were Islamophobic comments coming out of BJP supporters, there was a pushback from countries in the Gulf saying, you are living in our country, you are, so many millions of you people are working here, and you're insulting our faith and insulting our people. And immediately Mr. Modi had to issue a hasty tweet apologizing on behalf of his supporters and urging them to behave. Then you have this other problem that in the Western world, people are saying, listen, if this is now an illiberal democracy, can we see it as a kindred soul that we should make common cause with? Is India still the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, liberal, diverse country that we were celebrating as an example of liberal democracy in the non-Western world? And these are questions that countries will ask themselves. And if they ask themselves that, they will less want to be involved with us, and including in our economy, than Mr. Modi would like.
Yeah.
So he has to realize that the two projects do go together. You cannot be illiberal at home and seek the benefits of a liberal economy outside. And I do believe that that may give us some hope that we can prevent the worst examples of bigotry and intolerance from running completely amok. Though if you look at UP, sadly, I don't think you get much encouragement to believe that that's going to happen.
In that context, while you seem to be passionately defending Nehru's idea of India, of modern India, you also seem to find fault with, if I can say, Nehruvian view of economy, of self-reliance, and what you called economic nationalism. And because you say that unlike a country like Singapore, India has frittered away 45 years of growth. So how do these two things sit, comfortably?
So that's my personal view. It's not obviously a party view, but I don't do any of my writing as a party person. I'm a writer on the one hand and a politician on the other, and sometimes the two overlap. But I try to be true to myself. I've always been more of a more liberal on economics. I've supported the Congress Party only after the liberalization of 1991, because I believe very strongly in social justice. but I believe you cannot finance social justice without economic growth. And therefore, it seems to me indispensable that we need to free the economy, let people prosper, not tie them down with rules and regulations that essentially curb their initiative, but that the revenues that come from the enhanced growth in the country should be used to support the weak, the marginalized, the dispossessed, those who need a leg up till the day they can become consumers themselves. It's this everlasting cycle of growth that pulled so many Western countries, people out of poverty and created their modern prosperity that I believe we too can also get to. So that's the main difference. But I would argue that my point of view is actually quite consistent with the essential argument that we need to be liberal both in terms of political democracy, which Nehru very much was, and in terms of economics, if we want to be as appealing a country to the rest of the world. Because certainly, if you look at what we are seeing with Mr. Modi's politics, his economics have been, in the first few years, relatively liberal and open. Now, of course, he's talking about Atmanirbharta, and there is a transformation there, or perhaps an imminent transformation there. It is not complete. But by and large, he was liberal economics and illiberal politics. And negative press internationally, and particularly in the Western democracies, make India less attractive for the investment which is so essential to create the kind of economic results Mr. Modi wants.
Another view which I thought was at odds with, you mentioned your party, was your view of supporting a presidential system of government, which you make at the very end of the book.
Yes, I mean, that's not a new argument. I actually first mentioned it way back in India from Midnight to Millennium in 1997 in a book and in some articles even before that date. So I go back a quarter of a century at least in my faith in the presidential system. But unfortunately, the shorthand term presidential system is often misleading because I'm not only interested in having a strong and stable executive, I want that too. What I'm interested in is an independent legislature that can hold that executive accountable. I believe the big flaw in the parliamentary system is once you have a majority in parliament, India anyway, Britain may be different, but in India, the parliament is reduced to a rubber stamp for you. The executive gets its way. There is never any honest challenge within parliament from within the ruling party. So having a majority on one election date guarantees you no trouble for the next 5 years. So that's terrible because that means that the executive can make stupid and foolish decisions like demonetization or the botched and hasty rollout of GST or the passage of these farm laws without debate and consultation. All of these things would not have happened in either an independent presidential system where the legislature is free of being beholden to the executive, or even in the British parliamentary system where the culture and tradition is different, where you don't have anti-defection laws and you don't have compulsory whips that mean if you vote against your government, you lose your seat in parliament. All those things don't happen in the Western world. And very often, for example, in the British debate about whether they should go to war in Iraq, people debated and spoke across party lines. What was the party line on one issue was not the way in which some of their leading members spoke in the debate. And that's the way the system is. But in India, it's not. Yeah. In India, if tomorrow I stood up and opposed a party stand, and certainly 10 times worse, if a BJP MP stood up and opposed the Prime Minister, he'd not only be out on his ear from the party, he'd be out of parliament. Now, those are undemocratic things. And so for me, in a presidential system, you separate the legislature and the executive. I'm a big believer in the Montesquieuian notion of the separation of powers. You need an independent executive that is not dependent on the whims of a legislative majority. You need an independent legislature that is not beholden to the president and can hold him or her accountable. And you need an independent judiciary that can decide if either of them is going too far in the laws they pass or the decisions they take. And if these three are independent, you have a real democracy. I believe that having the kind of parliamentary system we have today is actually unfortunate because I've sat in parliament and seen how pointless serious discussion and debate is because the other side essentially has its mind made up, not its mind, but the cabinet and the prime minister in this case have decided how they will vote. And even when I can see them nodding in agreement with what I'm saying, they cannot actually manifest their agreement by supporting an amendment by me or whatever, because the whip is cracked and they have to vote exactly as their party tells them. That's not, to my mind, a complete democracy.
Yeah. And these, for example, on the one hand, you acknowledge that the modern notion of the nation is, a kind of a 19th century idea. And also, but at the same time, you also acknowledge that India has had both geographical as well as a cultural unity, in the past also. And therefore, the idea of the nation may be a kind of a gift of the colonial rule, but the cultural unity always existed. So the question is, if that is true, then what is wrong in trying to recover that cultural unity through what you call cultural nationalism?
No, so voluntarily, if it's done, I have no problem. I've written, for example, again in India from Midnight to Millennium, how a really Christian family like the tennis-playing Amritraj family, where the parents are called Maggie and Robert, and the children all wear crosses around their neck while they play tennis. But what are the names of those children? Vijay, Anand, and Ashok. And why is that? It's very much that they feel, even though they're good, devoted Christians, and Vijay kisses the cross when he makes a good shot. I mean, this is now some years ago. The point is that they see themselves culturally as identifying with India. And in fact, I know Vijay Amritraj rather well, and I consider him a very proud and patriotic Indian who, despite living in the Western world for 40 years, has never taken any other passport. He remains a very proud Indian. And he calls himself Vijay Anand and Ashok for cultural reasons. So that kind of cultural assimilation done voluntarily, for me, is fine. I mean, in fact, in my constituency, I have Muslim constituents, voters, party workers who bear Hindu names. And that's their choice. I mean, I don't think that they have to, but they feel culturally more at one with people when they don't have a name that automatically identifies them as being different from the people whose votes they are seeking, if you like. Now, these things are, if you like, part of the cultural assimilation that's done voluntarily. But the moment you tell somebody, oh, you cannot bear an Arabic name, or we don't want you to write Urdu, you have to only write in the Hindi script, or whatever other example you can think of imposing your understanding of culture on others, that's not cultural nationalism, that's cultural division. That is actually, I mean, there is a big difference, it seems to me, between unity and uniformity. And what the Hindutva Brigade wants is uniformity. That is not cultural nationalism. That is their attempt to obliterate alternative kinds of culture.
Yeah. In the book, you broadly categorize 9 kinds of nationalism, and then focus on 2 kinds of nationalism: ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. And so could you please quickly make that distinction very clear? I mean, although...
Well, basically, one kind of nationalism is the nationalism that emerges from immutable factors to do with your basic identity from birth. It could be your ethnicity or race. It could be your mother tongue or language. It could be your religion. In India, it could also be your caste. It could also be your region. Whatever it may be, these are things you can't help. You didn't choose, you're born into it. That's ethno-religious, linguistic, whatever, nationalism. So if you want, you can summarize it as ethno-religious or ethnic nationalism, but basically the idea is things that are linked to your identity. Versus civic nationalism, which is not anchored in identity, but emerges from constitutions and institutions, that basically says anyone can be a nationalist in our country, provided he or she subscribes to the following rules, the following procedures and practices that we've got in our constitution, that respects the processes, which, by the way, have to be liberal democratic processes. There is no civic nationalism without liberalism and democracy, because constitutionalism requires the right for everyone to equally participate in its benefits. And that's why you have to have a democracy. You can't call yourself civic nationalist and be a tyranny, because if you were, then you are automatically excluding some people on some grounds from their right to enjoy the full benefits of participation. So civic nationalism is, say, the US model. It is also the model very consciously chosen by our founding fathers and mothers in the Constitution of India in 1950, whereas the Hindu Rashtra idea is the alternative idea of India. that doesn't see India as an equal land of all sorts of people, but sees India essentially in their own memorable slogan as a country for Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. Now, it's a very interesting debate that goes back to some time. I've discussed it already in my previous book, Why I'm a Hindu, where you look at the writings of people like Savarkar, Golwalkar, and Deen Dayal Upadhyay, and what you find, they rejected the constitutional idea of Indian nationalism because they said, in fact, Upadhyay said it very clearly and very well. He said, listen, this idea of Indian nationalism, the constitution seems to assume that the Indian nation is a territory called India and the constitution is written for everybody on that territory. Wrong, says Upadhyay. A nation is not a territory, a nation is a people, and the people of India are the Hindu people. And the constitution should have been written for them only. Everybody else is a guest or an interloper. This is the Savarkar, Golwalkar, Upadhyay idea. And that is the alternative idea of India to the one that I argue, which says, according to my constitution, everybody on this country, citizen of India, has the same rights. It doesn't matter whether he worships differently, speaks a different language, has a different color of skin, eats a different food, wears different clothes. Doesn't matter. Ultimately, you can be, as I said earlier, you can be multiple things and one thing, but that one thing is being Indian. Now, these are two completely opposed notions, Professor Saab, and it seems to me that there is a battle between them, because I would say to every Indian, you belong to my idea of India, and as my patriotism embraces you. Whereas the Hindutva people would say, you only belong if you will subscribe to A, B, and C. If you consider Ram to be the Maryada Purushottam you must worship. If you speak Hindi, if you do not honor any gods or religious places outside the sacred soil of our country, all of those ideas which have been passionately articulated by Hindutva are anathema to me, because they represent a much more restrictive, intolerant, and exclusionary version of what India should be all about.
I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was Golwalkar who scoffed at this idea of everybody enjoying nationalism, and he called it Sarai nationalism. Unless you, as you mentioned, unless you subscribe, unless you swear, by their notion of nationalism, you are just a mere traveler, a temporary resident, not necessarily. And in this context, you have taken a lot of pains in the book to distinguish between commonly confused sets of words. And three sets of words I would like to mention here, and I would like you to explain them. One, citizenship and nationality. And the second, state and nation. And the third is, actually the second will be state, nation, and nation state.
Okay.
Right. And the third set would be, of course, much simpler, I would say, nationalism and patriotism. So if we can go back to the first one, citizenship and nationality.
Right. Well, I mean, the idea, frankly, is very clear that citizenship is something that is basically given to you by a state. It's how can we put it? It's a status granted by a state, which carries with it certain rights, such as the right to vote, to own property, to seek consular protection abroad, and so on. And citizenship usually comes with entitlement to a passport. Nationality, many would argue, is a fact of being. You can consider yourself the national of a country on ethnic grounds, linguistic grounds, other grounds, without having been legally accorded citizenship. And in fact, you may remember going back to the 1930s, Hitler arguing that the German-speaking or ethnically German people of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia were actually Germans. Even though they carried Czech passports or they had Czech citizenship, they were German nationals. And he talked about reuniting them, and he marched in and took over that territory. So that is the distinction. Now, let me add to that one more distinction to make it a trio of words, and that's patriotism. Because for me, patriotism is nothing more than the love of your homeland. It's an emotional feeling which says, I love my country because I belong to it, and it belongs to me. That's the thing. That's so broadly citizenship, nationality, and patriotism. Now, what was your second set?
State, nation, and nation state.
Okay. Well, state, of course, is, you know what a state is. The government comes out of setting up a structure of administration and authority, legitimizing authority through government, and that is a state structure. A nation state is one in which that state structure is identified with people of a particular nationality. So, for example, when nationalism arose in opposition to empires, which were usually, by definition, multinational or multi-ethnic empires, like the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so many others, the argument was made that we are people of a common nation, identified by ethnicity, language, and region and territory, and we deserve to have a state of our own. So when, for example, those who were Greek-speaking and Christian and lived in Greece wanted to be free of the Ottoman Empire, they wanted to create a nation state called Greece, rather than be part of the Ottoman Empire. Or if you want to look at the creation of modern-day Yugoslavia at the end of the First World War, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they said, we are all Slavic people ethnically. We are united by that ethnic origin. In fact, they all descended from the same settlers in the Balkans in the 7th century, and we are all Southern Slavs of Southern Europe, and we want to create our own country. And thus Yugoslavia was born. By 70 years, however, the sub-national ideas within that nation state created a demand for 6 nation states within that nation state, where the Croats said, we are separate because apart from being Slavs, we are also Catholics, whereas the Serbs are Orthodox. And the Slovenians said, yes, we are Christian and white and Slavic, but we are much more Western in our orientation. We are from territorially western part of Yugoslavia. We don't want to be subject to domination by the others. And then the Bosnian Muslims said, but we are Muslim. We are also a separate nation. And then the so-called Macedonians said the same thing. And you're finding ultimately that today, 6 nation states have emerged from what used to be 1. And now Kosovo, of course, is also claiming to be separate. So that's where the national identity seems to coincide with the state structure. Now, India is a state that in our terms we speak of as a nation state. It's a state for the Indian nation. But the Indian nation subsumes multiple ideas of religious and other diversities and regional diversities. And if you were to look at the Marxist way of looking at it, they would claim we are a state made up of many nations, just as they call the Soviet Union, a union of many nation states.
Yeah. In fact, in that chapter where you say we are all minorities, right? Apart from all the theoretical argument in the book, what I found really interesting are the human stories. You know, the human stories of somebody like Omar Bhai, your colleague in the UN, and of course the well-known story of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. But also, interestingly, your teacher in St. Stephen's, the history teacher in St. Stephen's, who desperately wanted to become Indian citizens. And a Pakistani like Omar Bhai tried for 2 decades, you write, to get an Indian passport.
That is Ansar Bhai, yes, Ansar Hussain Khan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then
Omar at the UN was the Swede.
Yes, and he was mistaken.
That's right, because
he was not recognized because he was black.
That's right.
Right. And Ansar Bhai, you say, tried for 2 decades to get an Indian passport. And but to me, the most interesting story is the story that you tell us about the languages that you just mentioned, languages, where you say, you know, this interesting episode of Deve Gowda addressing the nation from the ramparts of the Red Fort, speaking in Hindi ostensibly, written in Kannada script.
That's right.
Then Manmohan Singh, again speaking in Hindustani, written actually in Urdu and reading it from right to left.
That's right. I sat behind him and saw it.
And that reminded me of an incident where I was in conversation with Gulzar Saab, and easily the most versatile of Hindi poets today. And Gulzar had translated Tagore into Hindi, and that was a launch of his English translation of his Hindi translation. So look at this. Tagore wrote it in Bengali, and Gulzar translated it into Hindi. But the wonderful thing was, when Gulzar Sahib was asked to read his Hindi translations, he was actually reading from right to left,
There you
because
are.
he had written the Hindi translations in the Urdu script.
There you are.
So I think that is what you called again and again, that the basic soul of India lies in its plurality and acceptance. And I think this is an idea that is under challenge. And you mentioned a host of theoreticians on nationalism, and
Right.
particularly you one thing that I thought I would mention is, around the same time that your book on Midnight to Millennium came the writer Rajarau's book, The Meaning of India. And in The Meaning of India, Rajarau says something very interesting about India. And he says, India is not a nation, right? India is a perspective. And he says, India is not a desha, India is a darshana. And he says, whoever has that perspective is an Indian, right? So that's a completely different kind of kind of a philosophical notion of the nation. So
yes, I had the great privilege of meeting. What an extraordinary man he was.
yeah, and one more about this linguistic diversity. I would like you to say how linguistic diversity, as you mentioned France, and
Right.
if you contrast that with the Indian Constitution, right from the beginning, 18 languages to begin with were recognized as official languages, whereas in
That's
a
right.
country like India, in a country like France, they made France the official language and set up an academy to standardize
That's
French.
right.
So I
And
think, yeah,
to make rules all the time as to
yes,
what could be admitted into the language and what could not be.
correct. And the other interesting, I would say, metaphor that you use for India is, if US is called the melting pot, you compare India with a thali.
That's right. I've been doing that for a while. But the idea is precisely that the US tries to stir everybody into one homogeneous kind of lump. Whereas in India, just like a thali where the different dishes sit in different bowls and therefore don't necessarily flow each into the other, but they belong together on the same platter and they combine together to give you a satisfying meal.
Mhm.
That to my idea, that to me is the idea of India. It's that all of us, in our different identities in which we remain, nonetheless are cooperating and coexisting and making a wonderful meal together of the whole Indian experience. That is, to my mind, the strength of India. I see diversity as a strength. The Hindutva movement sees it as a weakness. I've actually argued in the book, Professor, about the difference between sort of my vision, which is the Nehruvian vision, if you like, of unity in diversity, uh, versus the RSS Hindutva notion of diversity in unity. So whereas I see the thali that we've just talked about, they see a kind of khichdi, where yes, there may be an occasional piece of carrot here or a piece of aloo there, but ultimately we're all part of one Hindu khichdi, Hindutva khichdi. And I don't buy that. I still see us as a thali, and I don't think that my Muslim friend who refuses to say Bharat Mata ki Jai is any way less Indian than I am, because my liberal democratic constitution gives him the right to stay silent when Mr. Amit Shah is declaiming Bharat Mata ki Jai. These are the differences that we must learn to accept.
Okay, one last question before we take up the audience questions is, the way forward. Because I think no matter how wonderful ideas we entertain, ultimately, I think it also needs a kind of a political power to bring those notions into practical life. So do you see a kind of optimism in what is going on, or do you think that this kind of a march of because we see the trends all over the world, and what is happening in India is no different. So what do you think is the way forward?
Well, I mean, to be honest, the whole point of the battle of belonging is there is a battle that needs to be fought. And that battle, to my mind, is one which is a struggle for the soul of India. If we don't stand up to defend that inclusive, capacious, broad-minded and sort of liberal constitutionalism that underpins our civic nationalism, if we surrender to the political majoritarianism of those who are trying to create a Hindu Rashtra on the soil of India, then, of course, I believe this battle would be lost and India would no longer be the India that we've been celebrating for the last 70 years of independence. So, to my mind, I think it's very important to stand up for these values and to defend them and to see, as it were, India through this phase of challenging its most precious assumptions. Whether we are doing well at the moment, I would say no, but it's also true that the other side is doing badly. We have never seen the economy in worse shape in the history of independent India. We have not seen a higher rate of unemployment than ever before, the economic mismanagement, the social incohesion and divisions that have arisen, particularly what we're seeing in Uttar Pradesh these days in the wake of their appalling love jihad law and the incidences we're reading reported in the papers every day. So the country is beginning to seethe with discontent. We saw it erupt during the Citizenship Amendment Act protests, and if it were not for the pandemic, those protests might still be going on. So I would concede the point that the opposition still has a lot of work to do to get its own act together and to mount a credible alternative challenge. But the government is doing so badly that I believe that challenge looks feasible, and I certainly have not lost hope.
And in that battle, do you see the Constitution as the only weapon that you can use?
No, I think we have to fight on multiple fronts. I think ideologically, the Constitution must be where we pin our faith, but there are also definitely important arguments on a material kind and economic arguments. Economics underpins politics at the very end of the day. I mean, if you can turn to a man who says he voted for Mr. Modi in the expectation of getting a job and ask him why he wants to vote for Mr. Modi when he still doesn't have a job. If you can turn to somebody who voted for Mr. Modi because he was promised a toilet and you ask him why he still wants to vote for Mr. Modi when he doesn't have any running water in that toilet, it's being used as a storehouse. Or why somebody was excited about a gas cylinder and has never been able to afford a refill. Or why somebody was concerned about price inflation is now paying the highest cost of petrol in the world to ride his scooter or get into an auto rickshaw. I mean, these are all questions that we need to battle on also. Economics is certainly a basis for challenging this government's incompetence, just as Mr. Modi used his vision of a greater, developed, growing and prosperous India as a selling point for his initial election. I think we'll have to turn that particular table against him because he has spectacularly failed to deliver that.
Let me quickly see the questions that have come in the chat box. Let me see, there are lots of comments, of course, but let me see if there are questions. All of them are saying, of course, what a pleasure it is to listen to you.
Thank you.
What a fabulous, thought-provoking session. And one question Shashi P asks, Dr. Tharoor, whose side of the argument of nationalism between Tagore and Gandhi do you find yourself?
Well, you know, Tagore was a great idealist. And I think he went farther than I would have gone. I've quoted him quite extensively in the book. Gandhiji was essentially an anti-colonial nationalist. His idea was that British imperialism was a sin. They had no business to be in India ruling us. And his whole logic was you hate the sin, not the sinner. Once the British go, we will forgive them for what they have done. And you know, there's a lot to be said for Gandhiji's kind of nationalism. Tagore said that all nationalism is basically bad. The only thing that matters is humanity. And that essentially, he even opposed the League of Nations, for example, on the grounds that when a bunch of nations are getting together, it's like a bunch of robbers forming a police posse. He says that essentially nationality is a wrong basis for dividing up humanity, and that ultimately it's only our common humanity that must unite us, which is very idealistic. But frankly, in today's world, we are not ready, I think, to embrace uncritically Tagorean ideas. But many of the things he said are really admirable, and I've quoted him quite extensively in the book.
And do you think this one of the weaknesses of our nationalism is also this, that it is anti-something rather than pro-something?
Well, nationalism by definition tends to be anti-something. That's why, again, when I draw a distinction between patriotism and nationalism, one of my sentences in the book is, the patriot is prepared to die for his country, the nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. There is a difference. I mean, the nationalist is also anxious to demonstrate the superiority of his nation against others. The patriot merely says, I love my country, it belongs to me, I belong to it. And you know, if somebody is attacking it, I will defend it and I'll die. But I will not go around needlessly attacking others. That's not my understanding of patriotism. Whereas nationalism has that assertiveness built into it.
Yeah, I think it's a similar vein. Murari Prasad asks, nationalism and hyper-patriotism blend into each other. Do you agree?
Yes, but not civic nationalism. And you know, my idea of patriotism, as I said, in the Indian context, is just love of homeland, which can start off, because we're such a vast country, it can start off with little local patriotisms. It can be my love of Idlis, or your love for Pesaratta, or somebody else's Jawaharlal Nehru weeping when listening to Lata Mangeshkar singing Mere Watan Ke Logon, and so on. I mean, all sorts of things, food, clothing, smells, atmosphere, cultural practices, all sorts of things can infuse your love of your nation. And it doesn't, to my mind, necessarily link up to the state. It is love of country. And that kind of patriotism, when the gentleman asks about hyper-patriotism, he really means hyper-nationalism, because it's turning a nation against something else. Whereas civic nationalism is all about liberal institutions in which you participate within your nation. It's not necessarily directed at someone else. I've got this lovely story of a Sri Lankan Australian diplomat who was an official I knew at the UN, who was an Australian citizen working for the Australian Foreign Service, loaned by the Australian government to the UN in a very interesting and responsible job, watching with me the Australia versus Sri Lanka final in the World Cup of 1996. And, you know, he started off being a good Australian and rooting for his side. After a while, he started getting more neutral. And then as the match wore on, his true patriotism, the country he was born in and grew up in was Sri Lanka. He was ethnically Sinhalese, completely came out. And in the last sort of, you know, third of the match, he was rooting for the Sri Lankans to win. The formal citizenship, the state, the job, the government, all that mattered much less than this emotional patriotism.
But Dr. Tharoor, you mention again and again civic nationalism, which is based on constitution and institutions. But once we also recognize that these institutions and the constitution itself is hardly 70, 73 years old, whatever, then in the long, you know, what Nehru calls the long march of history, this is like a blink of an eye.
True, and in fact, the criticism often made of me is the argument that I'm acting as if Indian nationhood started in 1950, whereas we are an ancient civilization. To which my counter is that our ancient civilization has evolved dramatically in the course of time, and that therefore, though the constitution may only be 70 years old, what we understand by Indian civilization today is also today's Indian civilization, which has taken into account all the influences over the last few thousand years.
Yeah. One more question from Arunji. He says, Dr. Tharoor, to what extent civic nationalism needs to be propagated and you know, awareness to be brought among people? What needs to be done in this direction?
Well, you can start by reading my book. I'm doing my very best to push the ideas in this book at every opportunity. I'd love to propagate it. Obviously, I don't expect the present government or the states in which it rules to be interested in propagating such ideas. But I certainly hope that there will be a welcome reception amongst those who have a more liberal-minded orientation to what we are all about. I mean, I think the whole issue of Indian nationalism is worth reading about, debating, understanding, even if necessary, fighting over. But this battle of belonging is this fundamental question of who belongs to India, who do we feel we belong with and to? And that is something that that is too fundamental to be just ignored or to be allowed to be carried away in a direction because of insufficient thought on our part.
Yeah. Sharada Balaji asks, wasn't it with a majority elected government that the emergency was promulgated in India?
Yes.
So, so majoritarianism per se can be very harmful?
No, there's a difference between majority rule and majoritarianism.
Yeah.
Majority rule is simply, first of all, one could argue that that depends on the system. I mean, in say France, you cannot be president without 50% plus one. In India, we've had governments formed with 30-odd% of the vote. In fact, Mr. Modi won 31% in 2014 and 37% in 2019. So he's not, strictly speaking, he does not represent the majority of this country. But he has a political majority, a parliamentary majority, and we respect that. Now, when it comes to majoritarianism, you define the majority as you find politically convenient. In the case of the BJP, it is the Hindu majority that they talk about as a communal majority. And then you impose the interests as you see them, the cultural norms as you see them, the language, the ethos, everything of that majority upon those who are unwilling to play by that. So you've seen just today this horrible news coming out of UP that after the passage of the so-called love jihad law, they have arrested a number of couples. They have actually gone and interfered with a wedding in which both parents had actually consented. So there was, as it is, it's astonishing to think they can interfere in the consenting wedding of two adults anyway. But they did so in this case where the parents had also consented and were present at the wedding, and they managed to stop it. Today, they have gone and attacked and disrupted a wedding between a Muslim man and a Muslim woman without realizing that the woman was also a Muslim. So in fact, it did not attract the question of the provisions of conversion. And this kind of behavior is what you would call majoritarian behavior. The imposition of the cultural preferences of a Hindu communal majority in Yogi Adityanath's UP upon those who have no wish to be subject to it. And that kind of majoritarianism is, to my mind, disgraceful. Now, on the emergency, I have been a well-known critic of the emergency. I've published a great deal about it at the time and in my book subsequently. But it was not majoritarianism in any meaningful sense. It was entirely constitutional, but of, shall we say, doubtful merit, and the way it was implemented caused a great deal of damage to the lives of many ordinary and innocent people.
Yeah. There's one more question from Vamshi Advait, who asks, is the problem that a liberal constitution is given to an illiberal people? Is that the problem?
Well, first of all, I challenge the argument that we are an illiberal people. And I also would argue that where you encourage and instill liberal values and norms, people get acculturated in that. I would say that it would have been possible for India to have been ruled differently. A different set of people might well have tried an illiberal approach, but we were blessed to have leaders emerging from the freedom struggle who actually believed in democratic institutions and practices and encouraged them. I've written in my book, Nehru, The Invention of India, about how Nehruji, for example, would go out of his way to show deference to the vice president and the president because they outranked him in the system. How he would, on one occasion when he said something intemperate about a judge at a press conference, he immediately apologized, wrote a groveling letter of apology to the judge in question, and then wrote to the Chief Justice of India apologizing for having insulted the judiciary. Now, frankly, he didn't need to do that. You think Mr. Modi would do that today? No way. But the truth is that he did that to demonstrate to the people of India that institutions are more important than individuals. He may be the larger-than-life Nehru who was the unquestioned most important figure in India. But the judiciary as an institution was distinct from the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister, he felt he had to show the people of India, had no business insulting the judiciary. And thus were our expectations formed of how these institutions should function in practice.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, just as you can inculcate these liberal values and respect for institutions, so also you can inculcate very different kinds of attitudes and illiberal ones. And if the questioner is implying that some of these illiberal tendencies are gaining ground in India, I would agree that that is so. And in the book, The Battle of Belonging, I've talked about the erosion of our autonomous and independent institutions, which have become more and more pressed by the government of the day. And these are certainly issues that cause me great concern and should cause all thinking Indians great concern.
I know there are plenty of other questions also, but I get a message from John that your next engagement is now scheduled and they're waiting. And so
I'm actually 6 minutes over the time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of this evening's program. And once again, on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, I thank Dr. Tharoor for taking his time out and being with us this evening. And we will see you again, not next 15 days from now, but actually we'll see you again on 8th of January because we are taking a Christmas break and we will not have our fortnightly session on the next Friday. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, once again.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you to the Hyderabad Literary Festival and
Thank
all
you
the
so
good
much.
people of that lovely city.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Jai.
Thank you. Thank you.